Okay, time to talk about the last Riddick movie, Riddick. This is actually the second time I've talked about this movie. I reviewed it not too long after it became available to watch on all the pirate sites. Right. So on the rewatch, watching the extended version, I definitely appreciated a few things that I didn't necessarily do this first time around because, like, in comparison to other theatrical cuts, that kind of glosses over as to why Riddick ended up, being abandoned on the planet. And, like, you would think, if memory serves based on that Vaku, ended up betraying Riddick like he wanted to do with the Lord Marshal and was responsible for leaving Riddick on the planet. Well, as it turns out that even though Riddick and Vaku, make it clear that they don't like each other, it was actually some other weirdo that ended up betraying Riddick and leaving him to die on the planet. So, because we ended up having that set up and other flashbacks for Riddick's background, you do get the idea that this is a different Riddick that needs to rebuild himself. And after seeing him, go down to his low, having him, conquer the new planet, you feel a little bit more, I don't want to use the word proud, but you just feel for Riddick. You go, okay, now Riddick's becoming the Riddick that we know, and then he starts using his conniving skills to, lure other people to him in a way to get off the planet. So, good on to him. And since that, a lot of people point out that this movie is like pitch black, and then we get to see a bunch of characters, quote-unquote stranded, and then having to deal with the problems that we've got with each other. Again, these interactions are interesting, but the problem is you've got, people who are motivated mainly for money, and then you've got people who have a little bit of a human being attitude still in their minds, but will admit that they will jump over that line if they need to save themselves, but will probably still think a little bit more rational, which is the bit for Boss Johns. Yeah, why do we call him Boss Johns? I don't really get that right. And those are all interesting, but the problem is, unlike Pitch Black, those things end up getting repetitive because, number one, we've seen this kind of interaction in the series before, and unlike Pitch Black, you get the feeling that there isn't really that much at stake in this movie. Now, I know what you're thinking, well, if it followed Pitch Black, doesn't it, mean that everything is at stake? Well, the problem is, in Pitch Black, they foreshadow that there's something lurking around that no one knows about. Here, there really is not that much foreshadowing at all. Oh, sure, they do have the clouds go in one scene before Riddick points it out to everyone else, but that doesn't mean anything because they don't do anything else. You just get the idea that, Riddick, is combating the planet, but we all think that he will be able to do it. It'll just take him a little longer than if he was in perfect health. And while Riddick is dealing with Santana's crew and Boss John's crew, actually the only person that, truth be told, we end up being worried about is Riddick. Okay? It's only at the end of the movie that everybody ends up having something at stake, and then we should begin to, broaden our horizons of thoughts, But that's 3/4 of the way into the movie. Pitch Black, I felt this from the get-go. Now I know what you're thinking. Why am I comparing this to Pitch Black a lot more and making these different comparisons when I didn't do that for my last video about this movie? Because I hadn't seen those 3 movies for a couple of years, so I was looking at this movie on its own. Okay? It's a lot easier for me to look at movies in comparison to other movies in a film series rather than just talking about it on its own, let me tell you. Okay? But that doesn't mean that I hated it, it just felt a little bit repetitive. Even though I'd still think that this is a fairly well done movie because, Riddick's thought process makes sense. Everybody else, fulfilled their part in, trying to combat Riddick and each other. There were a few surprising moments, and we did actually care for the supporting characters in this movie in comparison to Chronicles, in my opinion. And I'll admit, the revolution that Boss Johns, is Johns' father, that did add an interesting twist to it. Because, it suggests that this film series does end up having more than, like, two-dimensional characters, even though Boss Johns isn't much more than a two-dimensional character. You just get the idea that he's a lot more level-headed and is willing to think some more, because the end of the movie gives the impression that, I don't like you, Riddick, but you were right about some things, and, there is an understanding between us now, that kind of a thing, right? So, And don't get me wrong, okay? I did get nervous for these people when the creatures started attacking them, but you get the idea that here it's just pure carnage. It isn't like a Pitch Black where the creatures, had a weakness or there were defenses. Here it's just shoot and hope for the best. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but given how they all talked about or foreshadowed, it's not as effective. And then one thing I want to talk about, Starbuck, Doll, I mean, is just that, I'm so familiar with recognizing this actor's face, with the new Battlestar Galactica. I just keep calling her Starbuck in, like, everything that I see her. Sorry, fans of her and the original Battlestar Galactica show, but Starbuck just, they keep, illustrating that she's probably a lesbian, right, pronounce it right, dingus, but towards the end, they throw in a couple of funny one-liners to illustrate that, maybe those two actually did, something. Just like, did you have to do that? I get the idea of a running joke throughout the movie, okay, but changing it like that at the end, that just didn't work well with me, in my opinion, right? Oh, and I feel like I should touch upon this with Boss Johns. His decision to eventually go back for Riddick after, he runs away without saying anything. Well, there's several reasons why he could have turned back. It could be that wasn't his original plan, but then he changed his mind. 2, he was always going to do it and didn't want to waste his breath. Starbuck or the kid, could have talked him into coming back. Who knows? There's any number of possibilities here, but given, what the movie was trying to do with his character, it's not all too surprising that he decided to come back for Riddick. Just he had to make a decision, because, he can't carry Riddick. Plus, he has the gun, so it is a little easier for him to defend himself, right? So, not exactly the best discussion about the movie, but overall thoughts were, I like it, but it is a little bit filler, and I know what you're thinking. Doesn't Chronicles kind of count as filler? Well, Chronicles had a little bit more of a goal, whereas I think this movie, despite it having its own individual goals, was more to reintroduce everybody to Riddick and then try and finish what everyone started with Chronicles. That's how I took it, right. And quick note about the Riddick video games. I've played Butcher Bay, and I really enjoy that game, but I haven't ever played not-furya. I should really find someone who's done a walkthrough of it and then get a little bit more information, even though it's not really going to change any thing really related to Riddick, because Butcher Bay, the main purpose of that was just to illustrate how Riddick got his eye bits, and then probably to show a little bit more of the rivalry with Johns, which I bet is something that not-furya will do, because technically Johns is still with Riddick, right? Oh, and rating for Riddick, I'll go with 4 critique, 3 personal, and call it a day. Right. See ya.